There it is. I just want to thank Devina and Andrew for organising this, and I've written my speech. I am in the middle of the mayoral campaign, which means I'm actually leaving at 2 o'clock to go to an event which I had to go to and then come back here to give this. I'm actually, some of you will also know my daughter Meg, who's doing a PhD in Sarah's lab in the biochem department, and she and her sisters are third-generation scientists. Obviously my daughters, but then my father-in-law has a PhD from Columbia University in the US. And so I think to some extent, sometimes you might feed up families where I don't know if it's biological or if it's actually sociological, that they end up going down this path. And what you will know, and I certainly know quite well, is that it's a very uncertain path. And the thing that everybody who does science has in common is that they find it intrinsically interesting. I've given a talk a couple of years back to the neuroscience postdoc group, and I had a couple of people, or actually postgraduate group, I had a couple of people come up to me and ask me about career. And the question I really asked them in the end, because you've seen all the stats, you know how unstable it is what else do you think you're going to do? And if they really can't come up with an answer, then you know that intrinsically, yes, you want to do this. And that has to be a truthful answer to yourself, because then you're saying, actually, why I'm doing this is because I find this incredibly interesting. And then you go on a journey of life. And part of those journeys might be the traditional, straight down the middle academic one, but you have to, the obvious thing you have to look at, and there was a graph there today to say it, your supervisor trains all these people, and only one of you is going to replace them when they retire. The rest of you are going somewhere else. I did do a traditional degree and then a traditional career. So I did a physiology degree and I specialised in the neuromuscular junction, so I became a neuroscientist. We didn't have a neuroscience degree back then. And I think one thing I did then, which I think was really important as I'm talking to you as graduate students, was I had 3 primary author publications by the time I finished my PhD. And so when I was going to get my postdoc, I wrote a letter, because believe it or not, I got my PhD so long ago, you didn't send an email. And I was getting ready to do my big OE, because I figured what I would do, I was going to combine my career development with going overseas and doing something interesting. I was determined not to go to the UK, because everybody goes to the UK. So I thought, I'll go to North America, and I said, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a city that I find interesting, and then I'm going to find a lab in that city that is in my field. I wasn't quite that specific, so basically said, can I find both together? So there was a lab at the Rockefeller in New York that was working on the same field as mine, and I wrote that letter, and Sarah kind of touched on it, what that letter should look like and how it should be addressed. I knew the guy's work. He was cited all through my PhD, and some of my papers were quite closely related to what he was doing. So the letter said, Lee Rubin was his name. I said, "Dear Dr. Rubin, I've read your work. I'm quite familiar with it. You know, I've published these papers. I think I'd like to work in your lab, and these are the things I think I'd like to do. Do you have a spot?" And because it's a letter, you have to send it off. And it was 8 weeks later, and I had the second letter written, which was going to a lab at UCSF, because I thought, if I can't go to New York, I'll go to San Francisco. And I quite literally had it in the envelope when the letter came back, and he said, "I've got a postdoc spot, so you can come and work with me." I then finished up, and then I got another letter from him saying, "Actually, I'm leaving academia, I'm going to industry, but there's a lab at Columbia that works on something a bit like this, so you might want to go and work with them." So I went to Columbia, which is in New York. I didn't know at the time it was an Ivy League university, so when I got there, it was a pretty intense place working in the medical schools in the Ivy Leagues. You're working 7 days a week. Your light days are Sunday, where you might do 2 hours. Saturday, you might do 4 hours. But Monday through Friday, they are 10-hour days. Although I started realizing that some people looked like they were doing 10-hour days, and you realize that they were faffing around till about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And then they'd start working. But the supervisor said, "Oh man, that person's doing a lot of work." That lab was not quite on my subject, so I was doing some work on what I was doing, which was neuromuscular junction formation, and I had an interesting result, which we were trying to get ready for the Journal of Neuroscience, and then a lab at Cornell put a paper out very similar. And I thought, oh, bugger. But I knew there was a big conference called the Society for Neuroscience Conference, and it has 20,000 people attend it every year. And I thought, well, they'll be there. And sure enough, I found their poster. And so I sidled up to them and introduced myself, and I said, oh, you should probably look at this. And I had a graph of my data set. And the person who then became my next boss obviously saw that I was a competitor and decided the best thing to do with a competitor is to absorb them. So I got a postdoc up at Cornell. And that was a very interesting time up there, but I then fell into a trap which I think you can really fall into. My original boss had been given a job at University College London to found a research lab to go after Alzheimer's disease, and Eastside Labs were paying for it. And he said, oh, do you want to come with me? Anybody who comes will be given a faculty position title. So I could have had a faculty position at University College. My supervisor at Cornell said, oh, no, you're too young, you're too inexperienced, don't take it. So I didn't. And then about a year later, I got a letter from, or it was an email by now, from the University of Texas saying we are developing a neuroscience unit and we'd like you to put your application in. And normally when you get approached by the search team, they're very interested in you. Again, I listened to the wrong advice and didn't do it. And then slowly but surely, those opportunities started to disappear. And I realized that your career is a bit like a fruit on a tree. It ripens, and if you don't take advantage of it at the right time, it then just rots. And so I was in danger of what we would often refer to as a permadoc. And I'm like, oh God, I'm in trouble. And I went for a job at the University of Maryland, and they interviewed me, and they said, listen, you're good enough, and we know you, but there's 3 people on this who have applied for this job who already have an R01, which is a fairly large NIH grant. And they said, you're not going to get a job unless you have an R01. And so you have to be made a research associate at Cornell so you can apply for these things. So I went back out, told them what they said, and the people at Cornell said, oh, we're not going to do that in our department. So I said, oh, okay. And then about 8 weeks later, I took a postdoc at University of Pennsylvania because I'm like, if I'd stayed there, my career would have died there. And I went from a very established lab to actually a young and up-and-coming lab. And I think, again, the choice is where do you go on these ones. I was pretty much the same age as the lab head that I worked for. She had done some really amazing stuff in repetitive imaging in vivo of synapses. And so I wanted to learn that technique. And I thought, at that point, I was in year 7 of my postdocs. Meg had been born. She was now running around the backyard as like a 1-year-old. And I got to the point of going, oh God, this could be it. I might not break through. And I got the Sunday paper, I think it's Philadelphia Inquirer. It's an enormous job section. I went all the way through it. And I got to the end and went, oh crap, I'm going to have to make this work because there was nothing in there that I wanted to do. And then Rita, my boss, she got asked to go up to Pfizer Pharmaceuticals, who had their worldwide discovery site in Eastern Connecticut, to give a talk on neuromuscular junction formation. And once she gave the talk, they said, actually, what we're doing is we're founding a muscle unit, and would you come and work for us? And she was well on the path to tenure track at a good university, so she said, no, I'm not interested, but I do have a postdoc who would be. So I went up, I gave the talk, I got the offer, and of course I immediately accepted it this time because I wasn't going to make that mistake 3 times. And it was quite funny because then I got the job offer letter, and this was back in 97 or 98, and the offer letter came in and it said, oh, we'll be paying you $90,000. And at that point, that was more than she was getting. And she was like, oh my God, you're getting more than I'm getting. And then I got another letter and they said, oh, we see how long your experience is, we've actually adjusted your pay, we're going to take you up to $95,000. So for me, that was, going to a big company like that was actually quite a relief. It had got rid of a lot of worry in my life about how I was going to actually feed my family. There were 2 times in my postdoc that we didn't have enough money to live on, that we were actually not getting enough money in to survive. And I think it can get that tough. And then going to Pfizer, it was quite a step in a different direction. The difference between academia and industry, as I like to describe it, well, when I described it to Americans, I said it was like football and baseball. You know, they're both ball games, but they really have almost nothing else in common. And someone else might be able to be good at both, but generally speaking, you're good at one or the other. And the difference between academia and industry really was how are you assessed and how do you get your reward? In academia, it tends to be centered around publications. So the better published you are, then the better the chances are you get more grant money, and therefore it's a circular relationship. In industry, it was based on your productivity. What products do you make? Because obviously I worked for a pharmaceutical company, and they weren't interested in basic research per se, although we did a lot of basic research actually, but it had to be to support a product being made, so in this case, drugs. I was the founding hire for a brand new unit, so I was brought in as what was called the disease area expert. So I actually did a massive amount of reading. It was jumping forward, I got laid off 10 years later when they shut our unit down, and they said to me, you know, they had this rather awkward moment where they take you into a room where they're going to basically pull out a gun and shoot your career, and they said, what do you want? And I said, well, can I keep my publications? Can I keep my reprints? And they looked at me rather bizarrely. I said, well, you own them, and I've got about 500 of them, so can I have them? And they're like, oh, okay. Because I was reading probably about, we had a great search engine. I mean, what you had there was so amazing. The amount of resource you had was phenomenal. So we had a big IT support unit that would be giving us our literature reviews, then we get printouts, and so I was probably skimming about 20 papers a week and probably reading, say, 2 a week intensely. And for that was to support what I had to do, which was to set up drug discovery programs. So one of the ones we did, and the one I took the furthest, was a selective androgen receptor modulator, they're called. It's a testosterone mimetic, it's a non-steroidal. And we set that up for burns units. We set it up not knowing what we were going to get, but in the end, we found that clinically it worked really well in burns units. And it brings patients out of cachexia and into positive nitrogen balance. Unfortunately, it had a market value of around about 300 million, and our marketing team said that was too small to develop into a product, so we finished the program and then it stopped there. About 10 years into being at Pfizer, they had made a major mistake in a cholesterol drug called torcetrapib, and they had promised Wall Street that they were going to replace their lead drug, Lipitor, with this drug. And it was going to bring in, I don't know, like $5 billion a year, which was quite a bit back in 2005, 2006. Halfway through the stage 3 trials, the clinicians started getting worried because they didn't like what they were seeing, and sure enough, when they unmasked the trial, it turned out that the patients on Lipitor had a higher cardiac event rate than the current standard of treatment. So the drug just died. That came out of the atherosclerosis unit in our cardiovascular and metabolic diseases unit, where I was in, and the reward for giving them the wrong drug at the wrong time was the whole division got shut down as part of their workforce reduction. So I ended up losing my job in 2007, but good redundancy, so I set up a small company called Myometrics, and I worked with a company in Michigan that had hired a whole heap of Pfizer chemists there when they'd shut down the site over there. Pfizer had gone out to 200,000 employees because it had merged with 3 other companies and had gone back to 50,000. Now, 1 minute to go and I'll get on to why I'm on the council. I'm not actually, it's not a career for me. I'm actually here with a biotech company in Dunedin, and while that's starting up, I had a bit of time on my hands. So I'm looking at being on the council for, say, 3, maybe 6 years, depending on what happens in a couple of weeks. Being a scientist is quite useful in that environment because it does allow you to bring a technical edge to some of the decision-making processes that the others don't have. ODT noted that. They said that I am what they called an intellectual heavyweight. Then they also said that sometimes I can be quite boring. So, so it's an interesting time, but it's not a permanent career for me. Okay, thanks very much.